Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Speaking for America, a conversation with the State Department and Pentagon spokesmen, hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service, known to many of you as GU Politics and the Walsh School of Foreign Service. My name is Grace Hsu, and I am a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service studying international politics and currently serving on the GU Politics Student Leadership Council. Throughout my time at Georgetown, I've had the amazing opportunity to be on a student strategy team and host the GU Politics podcast, while also serving as an editorial assistant for the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs in the SFS. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Ned Price, a 2005 graduate of the School of Foreign Service, is the State Department spokesman for the Biden administration, an adjunct professor in the SFS, and served as a National Security Council spokesman during the Obama administration. John Kirby, a retired Navy Rear Admiral, is the Pentagon spokesman, an adjunct professor in both Georgetown College and the SFS, and served in the Obama administration as the State Department spokesperson. The conversation will be moderated by Marie Harth, a Fox News political commentator, former senior advisor for communications at the State Department, and most importantly, a former GU Politics fellow. Marie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you to GU Politics and to the School of Foreign Service. I know that the three of us will take any opportunity to come back to Georgetown, even virtually, and we'll look forward to doing it in person once we can all come back together in person at some point, hopefully not in the too distant future. So I am going to start with the conversation. I'm going to ask about a half hour of questions to my friends and former colleagues, John Kirby and Ned Price, and then we'll turn it over to all of you to ask questions as well. So as we're talking, start thinking about what you might like to ask them as well. So I'm going to start with I think, sort of an overall question for both you, John, and Ned. You know, speaking for any administration from a podium is a huge responsibility, including about issues of war and peace, including about issues of complicated and sensitive diplomacy. And I think there's another layer of complication when there's a change of administration. We just went through that. And so I wanted to ask both of you, how do you navigate that change in administration? Because at the Pentagon and the State Department, there are a lot of career employees there, whether they're in the military, whether they're a foreign service officer, and they serve at the pleasure of any president. But you're both political appointees and represent a certain administration with new policies than there was a week ago when you took over that podium. So I guess I'm curious to both of you, how do you navigate that change in administration, and how do you take care of both issues, talking to your workforce that was there before you, but also making clear that there's a new team in town? How do you navigate that?
Ned, do you want to go?
Please, John, go ahead. I'll follow you.
My question wasn't that hard. You do this every day, too. John, go ahead and kick us off.
For the military, you know, it's not uncommon for them to work through transitions. And the military has a very non-political, apolitical role in society. And so the civil servants and the uniformed officers in the military and the Pentagon, they're used to changes in administration, and they're used to, you know, advising and then following and executing the orders of the new team. And so for me, it hasn't felt, it hasn't felt all that different, and it hasn't really been that much of a stretch to come in. I think obviously the existing people there in the Pentagon, they're certainly eager for guidance. They want to understand where the new administration is going on certain issues so that they can back it up and execute. But it really hasn't been that big of a transition for me, you know, going back and dealing with these issues. Because many of the issues, while the Biden administration may approach it differently, they're issues that are longstanding, whether it's tensions with China or with Iran in the Middle East, or nuclear proliferation, and of course terrorism. All issues that they fully expect will carry on in coming months.
I would absolutely agree with that. And I suppose I would first say thank you to Georgetown for doing this, and Marie for hosting, and John, it's always good to see you. I will just say quickly that when I was offered the position of State Department spokesperson, the hardest thing I had to do was to call Georgetown and to say I couldn't teach in the spring, because I really did love my time back on the hilltop. I have spent far less time behind the podium than either John or Marie since I've been on the job for 2 weeks, but I think I've spent far more time on the hilltop. So I think that makes me the most qualified for this panel, at least. But no, it's great to do this. I think what John said is absolutely right in terms of the State Department as well. There are at present about 100 or so political appointees within the Department of State. There are 77,000 employees of the State Department, both at Maine State in DC, other domestic posts, and then of course around the world. So this is an administration that I think first and foremost values and embraces career expertise. It was something that then candidate Biden spoke quite a bit about, whether it was in terms of COVID, following the science, following the data, whether it was in other realms. And we are doing precisely that. Just to give you one example, Secretary Blinken has had more than 3 dozen, I think it's about 45, 46 introductory phone calls with his counterparts around the world. Before each and every one of those phone calls, he's been briefed by the career desk officers in most cases. That is to say, the career foreign service officers or civil servants responsible for a particular portfolio. Because we recognize that, these are the people who have worked these issues for years, if not decades. These are the people who have the background, have the experience, and have the expertise. And yes, it is true that you need a president, you need a Secretary of State, you need a Secretary of Defense to set the policy direction. But you can't move in a particular direction unless you bring these institutions along with you, and unless you leverage that background and that expertise that in almost all cases resides with the career workforce. So, every transition poses its challenges. This one, I think, is challenging in any number of ways, given our inheritance. But we see that partnership between the political appointees at state or other departments and agencies, and with the career workforce is something we have to get right, and something we would be kneecapping ourselves if we weren't leveraging that. And it's something we've tried to do at state, and I know it's something that has been prioritized throughout the interagency as well.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask a couple other institutional questions and then dive into some specific issue areas that I know people are very interested to hear about. The first is to pick up on this idea of the power of the podium. What role do you see both of your jobs playing in, I would argue, rebuilding trust overseas with our partners and allies, or even just convincing other countries and people around the world that every 4 years there won't be huge swings in American foreign policy? How do you approach that piece of the job, this trust building piece of it? Ned, do you want to start, or John? Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. I mean, the briefings, the on-camera briefings, whether they're by the spokesperson or other subject matter experts in the building, are really important on a couple of levels. One, it's an opportunity to articulate and explain the policies that we're pursuing and that we're implementing at the Pentagon, what we're doing with the taxpayer dollars, and just as more critically, their sons and daughters who raise their right hand and sign up to serve in the military. So we have an obligation, we believe, to explain and articulate what we're doing with those precious resources in defense of the country. Number two, I mean, and I think Ned would agree, that the briefings themselves serve as sort of a forcing function for policymaking itself. Because when you're interacting with the press every day and you're getting these very tough questions, it does make you as a policymaker sort of stop and think about, well, do we really have it right? I mean, does it stand up to scrutiny? And then the last thing for us is that it's also a terrific alignment tool. These briefings, the constant interaction with the press, we're not up every day like Ned, but we're up 2 to 3 days a week. It does help us align the department's messaging on a wide scope of issues. If we're saying it from the podium, then our 4-star generals and admirals and other senior civilians throughout the department will then have sort of a song sheet. They'll at least know what the Pentagon is saying about it, and that can help drive alignment and messaging all over the world.
I would very much echo that last point, well, all of it, but especially that last point. If you don't have a spokesperson or a secretary or a senior representative going out and speaking publicly, in the case of the department, embassies around the world, posts around the world aren't going to know in all cases where the department stands, where they should be. Ambassadors may not know what message it is they're supposed to convey, either publicly in town halls or their own media interviews, or in their private interactions with their host country counterparts. The same is true at departments and agencies around the world. And I think over the last 4 years, much of the world and much of our own workforce was left asking themselves where America stood. And so it's really important when you talk about this idea of trust, Marie, that the world knows where we stand. And some of that is conveyed in the form of demarches and diplomatic cables, consultations in country. But some of that is also conveyed from the podium and at state, from the White House podium, from DOD. It's one of the most important tools we have to leave no doubt as to where we are on a particular tactical issue, the coup in Burma, for example, or on these broader and more strategic questions. What is the United States government, what is the administration's approach towards democracy and human rights, for example? What is it vis-a-vis Russian aggression in its different forms? And so we have heard at the department, at least at the State Department, in the past couple of weeks that, they really do embrace the practice of regular briefings, not only because it, of course, is the right thing to do in terms of transparency and in terms of engagement with the press and the public, but it's more than just a virtue. It's actually a strategic imperative for our building, for the department, but also around the world. Countries can't trust us if they don't know where it is that we are, and so it's critically important, and it's a tool that pays dividends well beyond the media and press and public messaging in that sense.
I think that's right, and John, I want to pick up on something you talked about, which is the briefings as a policy forcing function. And I want to talk about Burma because Ned, you brought it up. We all the three of us lived through the pain debates about whether Egypt was in fact a coup. And when you don't have a clear policy decision made by the administration, that makes your jobs really hard. In contrast, I think a lot of people on the outside said, wow, you guys made that Burma decision very quickly. You called it a coup. You said there were going to be consequences. It was a crisis in the first days of this new administration. So talk through that a little bit. How do you see that issue playing out? And what does that tell you about how the administration will make decisions and how you'll be able to talk about them, hopefully pretty quickly? I want to know why John is laughing. I want to know why you're laughing.
I'll definitely defer to Ned on this one because this was obviously the State Department was clearly in the lead on this.
Well, you were right. This took place within the first 10 days or so of the administration. I think if you had asked any number of people what they thought the first big foreign policy challenge would be, Burma probably wouldn't have been on the top of many people's lists. Of course, the trajectory had at least initially been headed in the right direction. I think the three of us were there in 2015 at a previous momentous moment. I think if I recall, it was a Sunday evening, and these reports first started to come in after a few days of some worrying indications about what was taking place with the NLD, with the civilian leadership in Burma. And at least DC time, I believe it was Sunday night, reports first started to emerge. By Monday morning, it was clear to at least a layman like me what appeared to have been the case. And the White House, the secretary, Others were very clear that we should move expeditiously. And in this case, we were able to do so and to move especially swiftly because the facts were clear and the legal analysis was conclusive. And it was within 24 hours that the department was able to make that formal determination that there was a coup. And some of you may be asking, well, what's the big deal? It's just calling something a coup. As with everything in the interagency, there is a formal determination of this issue. It's something that has to meet a particular threshold. It's something that the state legal advisor, the State Department's legal advisor, has to certify. And in this case, that certification was made within, as I said before, 24 hours, and it was within days. It was mid last week, as I recall, that the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, and USAID announced at least the first tranche of a policy response in the form of sanctions against individuals and entities responsible for this, export controls that the Department of Commerce put forward, and USAID restricted some of its funding to ensure that we didn't provide any aid that would go to those responsible for the military coup. So I think, to your point, Marie, when we can act swiftly in government, it is often to our advantage to do so. But rarely is something, never is something black and white, in fact, in our realm. This case was starker, I think, than most. But part of speaking for a department like the Department of State is you need to ensure that you're on solid ground. The last thing you want to do is go out and say something that's premature, that sends the wrong signal, because that goes back to the issue of trust we were talking about before. If we are to get ahead of ourselves, if we were to say something we would come to regret later, I think it erodes that sense of trust and credibility that we're trying to build up the world over. So we're trying to strike that balance, acting quickly, acting swiftly, and all the while building up that trust and credibility around the world. And this is an early test case of that.
John, I want to pick up on with you on something that Ned said, which is all issues are not resolved this quickly, or at least part of the issues are not resolved this quickly. And there's often a lot of interagency debate. And you're one of the rare officials who has spoken both from the State Department podium and the Defense Department podium, which are very, well, I don't know, you tell us if you think that how different they are and how similar they are. In each of those roles, how do you work through issues, especially at the Pentagon, where people know there are ongoing policy reviews, but no decision has been made? That's a hard place to be in.
It is sometimes, and you get that pressure from the press corps. They want the answers right away, and so you have to be willing to point to process sometimes. And while as a spokesperson, that's an easy thing to do, to say, well, there's a process ongoing, I'm not going to get ahead of that. It does sometimes, if it's done too long or on too many issues, it creates a little bit of tension. So and we're in the early stages here of an administration that is still working their way through where they're going to land on certain policies. And I think it's important to make sure, and I know Ned's feeling this pressure, I certainly am, but we spokespeople have got to give them the time and the space to do that, even if that means, the occasional uncomfortable question about process. As for the differences, I mean, the big difference between the two podiums is precision. At the Pentagon, it's really important that I can accurately describe the capabilities we're putting in the field and in the fleet, and how we're using the arbiter of force to help bolster our diplomacy. At the State Department, the words are the weapons, and they have to be precise. I remember very clearly many times using an adverb differently on one day than I did the second day, and I got called on it. The words are so incredibly important, and that was a big adjustment for me. Having been in the Pentagon for 10 years and then going over to State, to really appreciate how specific and how detailed you have to be, the way you articulate things. It really does matter a lot. Tone is much more important at the State Department, I think.
Well, and Ned and John and I all know, if a foreign leader does not like one word you use at the podium, they will pick up the phone and they will call John Kerry or Tony Blinken. We've all been there, Ned. Hopefully you won't have the same experience. But Ned, you've represented the NSC, the CIA. You and I both were media spokespeople there, and you've also represented the NSC. What do you see as the differences between those different places that you've worked?
Well, so going back to our time at the CIA, that was an institution that I think has or at least had a very different approach to the media than really anywhere else in government. Oftentimes we were playing defense. Oftentimes it was about doing all we could to ensure that sensitive equities, whether it was programs, whether it was details, classified details, to mitigate the harm of that release. And so, I was there. I started in 2013. And I think it was 10 days into my time in the CIA press office that a guy named Edward Snowden decided to release a bunch of NSA files. And so that really, I think that really set the tone for my time there, playing defense, doing all we could to protect sensitive equities in the context of a very free and open and competitive press. When at the NSC, your remit is much broader. It's no longer just intelligence issues, and it is foreign policy issues across the world. But the job is also different from the one I'm in now, because at the White House, you have the luxury of a White House press secretary. You have the fun job of briefing the person who will then go and take the tough questions. At the State Department, my role is different. I'm the one taking those questions. But what has struck me and what I knew, at least somewhat going into it, is that the role when you're speaking from the podium at the State Department, you're really speaking to policy. And as John was saying earlier, the words you use and the precision of language is just so important because you have, as I was saying before, embassies around the world watching it for their own messaging, but you have world leaders and you have ministries of foreign affairs around the world that are watching this day in, day out to determine where it is the United States stands, especially in the context of a new administration, to determine if we are shifting our policy, if we're taking a different approach, if we're sticking with the same approach. And so the advent, one of the new pieces of technology we have in government is an iPad, at least at the State Department, rather than the big briefing book you may have seen before. It is just so important that on especially sensitive issues that the language be precise. In my first couple of weeks there, I have found myself in many cases just sort of reading where we are because you don't want to stray from that text, knowing that the implications could be profound in terms of foreign policy and national security. So it's a very different job from the NSC and certainly from the CIA. But it's one that also brings tremendous reward in having the opportunity to speak for our foreign policy around the world.
Yes, that iPad is a huge technological breakthrough. We had these huge thick binders. And so that was something that the Trump administration started, I think. So we will give them credit for that. I want to turn to another substantive issue that I know a lot of people have questions about, and that's Iran. We all lived through the Iran nuclear negotiations. Obviously, there are many issues with Iran, whether it's ballistic missiles or support for terrorism, where we have huge, huge concerns about the role they play in the region and also their behavior at home. This is one of those issues where the Obama administration had a very clear policy. We all worked for that administration, but a lot has happened in the last 4 years. And you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. So how do you think about that issue from the podium? How do you talk about the path forward on a policy where previously, the administration Joe Biden was a part of had a real point of view? What's different now? How do you talk about those differences and what's happened over the last 4 years? How do you look at that?
Ned, go ahead.
Sure, I'll happy to start. Look, I think when it comes to Iran and when it comes to just about any other issue under the sun, I think what we start from the proposition that restoration is neither in the cards nor is it strategically wise. And what I mean by that in this case is that we're not just seeking to go back into the 2015 Iran deal as it was in 2015. To steal a phrase from a senior administration official, we're trying to build back better in different ways. And I think the Iran, the way in which we seek to put limits on Iran's nuclear activity and the ways in which we seek to regulate Iran's broader malign activities, what we're trying to do is to, one, use that 2015 deal not as the ceiling, but as a floor. And in this case, to use it as a platform for, together with our partners and allies, to negotiate a longer and stronger deal in terms of its nuclear constraints. But then also to use that as a launch pad for follow-on negotiations to address the other areas of Iran's malign activity and behavior. And ballistic missiles, of course, is on top of that list. And so it's the Iran deal. I think we have, you have heard everyone say from 2015 to 2017 to now. I don't think anyone is calling it perfect. And in fact, no internationally negotiated agreement or deal ever is. But in this case, we are seeking to we have put this proposition of compliance for compliance on the table. That is to say, Iran re-enters and resumes its full compliance with the Iran deal. And we would do the same as a way to build on that and to go beyond where we were in 2015 for a deal or a set of deals that is appropriate for the world we've inherited in 2021. And I think that's really what we're trying to do across the board. We often hear, well, the same people are back in government. Is this Obama 2.0? And, to think that we could, or we would want to seek the same policies in 2021 that may have been applicable in 2009 or even even early 2017. It's just pure folly. The world in 2021 is profoundly different than it was in 2009. It's profoundly different than it was in 2017. And I think there are elements that distinguish our broad approach to foreign policy that we're happy to chat about. But the idea that we're just trying to go back to the way things were before and to restore the order that we left behind in 2017, I think it misunderstands profoundly what we're trying to do.
I would just piggyback on that. I mean, very much in the military, we're jumping on a pony in stride here. I mean, and we recognize that as we come on board, that Iran's malign activities in the region haven't decreased, and in some ways they've increased and become even more severe. Whether it's Shia-backed militia attacks on our facilities in Iraq, whether it's putting mines on ships, these things were not necessarily happening at the pace or the scope that they are now when we left in 2017, early 2017. So for the Pentagon, it's in the civilian leadership at the Pentagon, it's very much getting an understanding of where things are now and whether we're postured appropriately in the region to deal with that. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, when the USS Nimitz left the region to start heading home through the Pacific, I mean, there was a lengthy discussion in the press corps about what message that's sending Iran, just the movement of a carrier home after being deployed for 9 months, and is she going to be replaced and when and all that. So we're very much kind of following in on a process here that has been, I think, is at some degrees at a quicker pace than it was when we left, and we're coming to grips with that too.
Well, in a minute, we're going to go to student questions. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, please do, and we will get to you very shortly. John, I want to ask you about a bucket of issues that in some ways I think is very unique to the Pentagon that you have to deal with. And I broadly call these sort of workforce issues. And not that Ned doesn't have them at state, but whether it's overturning or repealing the transgender ban, whether it's this issue of radicalization or potential radicalization, you represent a huge workforce, and there are a lot of issues. We used to talk about the role of women in the military. We still do in many ways. What are the most important issues, I guess I would ask you, that you and the secretary are focused on talking about to the workforce and to the world? And how do you go about communicating those? That's not a question of, how many ballistic missiles Iran has. There are issues that are very personal to many people.
Right. So there's 3.5 million people in the military, if you count Guard and reserves. And of course, more than that, when you're talking about our military families, who we very much consider part of the team. And we are reflective of society. It's an all volunteer force. So everybody's a volunteer. And we try very hard to make sure that we are representative of the American people that we're defending. Sometimes we get that representation right, sometimes not. And so we're dealing now with some tensions that are reflective of tensions in civilian society. And you mentioned extremism. That's a really good one. And it's got the secretary very occupied lately. He just ordered a stand down, a one-day stand down over the course of the next 60 days for the entire force, to spend a little time focusing on extremist ideology inside the ranks, because it's there. Now, we may be, we think it's probably less of a presence in the ranks than perhaps the headlines would suggest, but probably more than we're comfortable with. And so we are grappling with what you would consider internal issues. And the way we're trying to do that is being frank and candid and completely open about what the concern is and what we're going to try to do about it. And earlier I talked about process. We're very early on. We're dealing with process right now. We got this stand down going on. I think you're going to hear more from Secretary Austin about extremism in the military and how we can kind of tackle this. It's not a new problem to the military, but what is new is the pervasiveness that social media has allowed this ideology to sort of permeate in and out of the ranks. You mentioned the transgender, reversal of the transgender ban. I mean, that was, we can't just go back, back to Ned's point about sort of, time and space. We can't just go back to 2016. We have to account for the changes that the Trump administration made and get to an equitable policy. So we're working our way through that. That's also on a 60-day tether. But it's really about, you can't over communicate when you're talking about people issues inside the military. The other one, of course, is the concern, the very real concern over institutional racism. We are reflective of American society, but we don't think we've got it right in terms of diversity and inclusion. And we'll be bringing on a specialist to help the secretary work through that. That too is something that just constantly needs gardening and leadership. So, and if you're going to garden in leadership, you got to communicate, and that's where our head is.
Yeah, I love that. Sometimes, earlier we talked about process sometimes taking too long, but process can also be very comforting, right? To say, look, we're in here and this is what matters to us. And we're going to not just make decisions on Twitter. We're going to put a process together and actually come up with what we think is the right path forward here. I want to ask you both, before we turn to the student questions, about disinformation. John, you mentioned social media and how it's made so many problems so much worse. Even since we were in government 4 years ago, how do you see it coming up more with reporters? Do you see it coming up in the briefing room more? And how do you plan to counter that? Are you getting involved online more or not? What are some tactics that you and your buildings are thinking about utilizing to counter this really dangerous problem?
Yeah, Mark Twain said best, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still tying on its shoes. And today, because of social media, you can't even find your shoes before you're dealing with a lie. And so, yeah, it is something that we're concerned about. I haven't felt it at the podium in the Pentagon just yet, but it's only been a couple of weeks. But it is something that we're concerned about. And I think we're going to be taking a broad look about how we employ social media at the Pentagon to be more fleet of foot out there. Back to one of Ned's points about sometimes you can be fast and sometimes you got to be slow. We have to be careful that in our zeal to be out there quickly and to try to beat back bad stuff, that we're not in fact making it worse by making a mistake. So we're trying to get our arms around this too. It's a tough problem, and it's not going to get any easier going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I would add, I think the best antidote to disinformation is information, and having our own messaging out there on a regular basis. And it's part of why then candidate Biden pledged that briefings would restart. It's part of why departments from across the interagency are active on social media. It's why we want to have our representatives out there in the media, writing op-eds, speaking at town halls, having their voices out there, because if we are going to try to combat voices of disinformation and misinformation, and frankly some of that is going to be state-sponsored, we need to make sure that people who are speaking for our policy and people who are part of our policy process are out there in this information space as well. I think it won't come as a surprise to anyone that the United States government hasn't always been the most nimble. We haven't always been the most effective messengers. We haven't always used social media and other tools as expertly as some of our adversaries have, both state and non-state actors. I think we need to change that, and it's not something that will take place overnight. Or even soon, but it's something that we are trying to make a priority, recognizing the challenge that disinformation and misinformation pose.
I'll tell you the other thing I would add to that, and we aren't as good at the Pentagon in telling stories. And really, if you think about disinformation and the impact that it has, it's because it's emotional. Usually, it's something that gets you mad, and if you're reading a headline that makes you angry, you got to be thinking about, is this really accurate or not? But it's the emotional tie of disinformation, and what we've got to do a better job at the Pentagon is tapping into the emotion for a positive take, and to be able to tell stories, to make it human, to make what the military is doing for the American people human and personal. I think through story we can also have a big impact, and that's just not something that we're all necessarily. It's not all in our DNA in the military, and we got to get better at that.
Yes, amen to that. I agree. And it's a hard problem. There are no easy answers. If any of us knew how to just defeat disinformation, we would be getting paid probably a lot more. So we're going to go to student questions now. Eleanor has our first question. Please tell us your school and year and where you're joining us from. Eleanor, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much to both John and Ned for joining and speaking for the Georgetown community today. I'm a first year Asia Studies graduate student at the SFS, and I'm Zooming from South Bend, Indiana. My question is strictly on US-China relations. So as we know, of course, President Biden spoke with Xi Jinping a few days ago. So one thing I'd like to really know is, how does the Biden administration plan on grappling with the delicate balancing act of approaching China as a strategic competitor, while also emphasizing the need to cooperate on both transnational issues and causes such as COVID-19 pandemic management, as well as climate change? Thank you so much.
I'm happy to start. Well, I think you were right when you stated that our approach to China is one of strategic competition. I think what distinguishes this administration's approach to China is that we are looking at it through that lens. We see China as a competitor, and our approach is to compete and ultimately to outcompete against Beijing in any number of realms. And when we talk about that competition, we also recognize the strengths that we bring to it. One of the most powerful is our system of partnerships and alliances. There's a reason why Xi Jinping and other authoritarians around the world often complain about our system of alliances and partnerships, because they understand them to be so powerful. They are indeed force multipliers. Two is our values. And these are oftentimes what glue us together with our like-minded partners and allies in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, around the world. And it's something that will be front and center and have been front and center in our foreign policy to date. But I think the other innovative aspect of our foreign policy is that the Biden-Harris administration recognizes the deep interconnection between domestic policy and foreign policy. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, often says foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. And I think it's especially true when you see that in the context of China, because it is a fact that we will be positioned to compete and to outcompete against Beijing most effectively if we are strong at home, if our workforce is educated, if we're firing on all cylinders, if our supply chains are secure, if our recovery is sustainable and durable. And that is, that's usually been confined to our counterparts on the domestic side of the house. But more and more, I think there's a recognition that you can't see these two realms as wholly distinct. You asked about the limited areas where there will be cooperation with the Chinese. And it's true that even in a relationship that is fundamentally competitive, with one as large as the bilateral relationship with Beijing, there are going to have to be areas where we do cooperate. President Biden did speak to Xi Jinping the other day, and the last line of the readout actually spoke to this. And President Biden said that he would be committed to pursuing practical, results-oriented engagements when it advances the interests of the American people and those of our allies. And that's how we look at it. We're not looking at cooperation as a virtue, something that we should do in the international system to play well in the sandbox. We're looking at it as a strategic imperative. It is manifestly in our interest to cooperate with the world's second largest emitter on climate change, on the existential threat of climate change. It's manifestly in our interest to find ways to cooperate with the Chinese on an issue as important as nuclear nonproliferation, stopping and limiting the threat from the world's most dangerous weapon. So there will be areas where it is profoundly in our interest to cooperate with the Chinese. I think these will be fairly limited compared to the areas where we'll seek to compete and ultimately to outcompete Beijing. But we are a superpower. We're the world's most strongest country. This is it's a hackneyed expression, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can find ways to hold China's feet to the fire, just as we pursue ways to advance our interests in the context of this bilateral relationship.
John, do you want to say a few words about China from the Pentagon perspective?
Well, I think Secretary Austin has said it very clearly many times. We consider China to be the number one pacing challenge of the Department of Defense. And so we look at it sort of in two ways. One is to make sure that everything we're doing is backing up all the things that Ned just talked about, backing up the diplomatic and economic levers of power in the country to give them the time and space and the credibility they need to be able to move policy forward with respect to China. And number two, it's to make sure that because we consider them a pacing challenge, because they are building out capabilities and investing in systems that are largely designed to prevent and to inhibit our access in the Indo-Pacific region, we have a concomitant requirement to make sure that we are fielding and buying the kinds of capabilities to preserve our ability to defend our security commitments in the region. 5 of our 7 treaty alliances, defensive treaty alliances, are in the Pacific region, and we take that very seriously. So we've got to make sure that in our budgeting and our research and development that we are investing in the right kinds of capabilities to keep China from outpacing us as they are now the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense.
Great, thank you, Eleanor. Our next question is from Alex. Please tell us what year you are and your school and where you're joining us from tonight.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a first year in the SCS, and I am Zooming from the Bloomingdale neighborhood of DC. And my question is, has there been discussion at the State Department about the fate of the Muslim minority in Myanmar in the wake of the coup? And if so, how is it being addressed?
Sure, I'm happy to start, and thanks for that question, Alex. It's obviously something we care deeply about. The Rohingya, the United States over the course of years has been the leading global provider of humanitarian aid to the Rohingya. $1.2 billion, I believe it was, since 2017. That is in both Burma and Bangladesh. And so when we announced the coup determination, I guess it would be a week ago today, and when we more recently announced that the sanctions and the export controls and the reduction in humanitarian aid, the first thing we said was that we do not and would not do anything that would imperil or worsen the already significant humanitarian plight of many in the region, including the Rohingya. And so as we take a look at our policy options, that is one of the guiding principles, that in the first instance, do no harm, just as we seek to hold to account the military leadership behind the coup on February 1st. So I think we are confident that we can find ways to continue providing that humanitarian aid through the State Department, through USAID to the Rohingya. I think we will continue to be the world's leading supplier of that humanitarian aid, even as we lead the world and galvanize a collective response to the coup in Burma. One final point: the then Secretary Designate Blinken was asked during his confirmation hearing whether he would support a review to determine whether genocide had in fact taken place against the Rohingya. That is something that is ongoing. There are offices at state that gather information, that consider the facts and the circumstances. And if that's where the determination leads, we won't be shy in making that public, just as the Secretary came to the determination that genocide had occurred in Xinjiang. It's a strong word, it's a strong label, but if that label is warranted in the case of the Rohingya, I am confident that we will be making that known from the department.
Great, thank you, Alex. Our next question is from Brian. You could tell us your year and your school and where you're joining from.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Brian. I am a first-year student in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown. So my question to both of you is, what are your thoughts on how the U.S. government can bring in these creative new ideas, outside perspectives to make concrete progress advancing our most pressing national security issues, so that we don't go back, to maybe sort of status quo foreign policy making? Thanks so much.
I'll defer to you on that one, Ned, for the start.
Well, I think in the first instance, I was reminded of the tried but true saying that personnel is policy. And there has been a premium on ensuring that across the interagency, but also at the Department of State, that we do all we can to recruit, retain, promote a talented cadre of experts who bring in those innovative ideas, but who also look like America. I think in many of our institutions, we have fallen short in terms of that diversity, and it's about more than metrics. It's about ensuring that we have the perspectives and the ideas and the right messengers in place to ensure that not only do we avail ourselves of those ideas, but that we can take advantage of them, we can operationalize them. So I think in the first case, that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make up in many ways for lost time. And I don't mean just the past 4 years. This is a challenge and this is a problem that has persisted for too long, including at the Department of State, and something that I know the Secretary is prioritizing. One other element I would bring into this is the recognition that government doesn't always have the best ideas. We don't have the monopoly on innovation, that is for sure. There are going to be some areas where it's appropriate and even necessary for us to partner with civil society, with the private sector, other non-governmental actors. And I think that in doing so, we can again avail ourselves of those ideas, take advantage of partnerships that will allow us to use them to our advantage, and again, incubate some of those ideas within our own institutions to ensure that we're as creative as a large bureaucracy can be.
No, I would echo all that. And as I said earlier, we certainly have diversity challenges in the military that we're trying to tackle in a more cohesive way than we have in the past. But even on issues like sexual assault in the military, which is still a scourge that we're battling in, the Secretary's already proven a willingness to reach out beyond the lifelines, if you will, to talk to people who have lived experiences that we can benefit from. With respect to some of these problems. And I think you're going to see that continue. And then the only other thing I'd add is the value of our allies and our partners. And every single phone call that the Secretary has had with a partner nation, with a counterpart, he has asked them, how do you see the issue? How do you see the region? What do you think we need to be thinking about? I mean, so we're definitely trying to make it clear that whatever we do in defense of our interests, we're also recognize that we operate in defense of alliance interests and partnership interests, and we're interested in what they have to say. This week, the Secretary will attend his first NATO Defense Ministerial on Wednesday and Thursday. And there's a lot to discuss. Obviously, there's a lot of alliance issues, but I can guarantee you that he's very much going to be listening just as much as he's transmitting.
Great, thank you, Brian. Our next question is from Jordan.
Hi, my name is Jordan. I'm a second year in the Eurasia Russian East European Studies program, and I'm calling in from Bethesda. And thank you both for talking with us tonight. My question's for Ned. When does the Biden-Harris administration and State Department plan to restart issuing visas, giving visa interviews, and loosening travel restrictions related to COVID, especially regarding fiancés, unmarried couples, and DV winners? And I guess, like, to link this to the question of speaking for America's place in the world and policy positions, how do you balance the big headline capturing questions and concerns and communicating policy with continuing to emphasize some of the quieter things that have historically made America as an idea globally attractive, such as welcoming refugees, supporting human rights, and being an open society?
Well, thanks for that question, Jordan. I think this goes back to much of what you heard from then candidate Biden on the campaign trail. As a candidate, he pledged to end the so-called Muslim and African bans on his first full day in office. He pledged to renew our commitment to the global refugee program, America's commitment to humanitarian aid the world over, any number of steps that speak to this. And when it comes to those two, ending the so-called Muslim and Africa travel bans, he did that on day one. When it comes to our refugee program, he has had consultations with Congress, and he has spoken to the administration has spoken to the ambitious targets that have been set for this current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. Now, we are doing this, of course, in the midst of once in a century global pandemic. And so the idea of opening America's borders and once again being that place of refuge and safe haven is made more complicated by that reality. When it comes to the State Department, some 90% of our consular services the world over have had to be curtailed, given not only our concern for our own people, but also our concern for those who would step foot in a U.S. consulate to make sure, or mission overseas, to make sure that we are protecting all of those with whom we would come into contact with. So certainly the hope is to resume a lot of those operations later this year. And I think increasingly that is becoming realistic, certainly as we see the distribution of an effective vaccine, both here in this country and around the world. And it's also something that we look forward to, because again, it will enable us to make good on many of those promises, including the ambitious refugee targets that the administration has set. It's incredibly important, especially after 4 years of a foreign policy that in many cases lacked that distinct American DNA. That we're able to make good on what candidate Biden spoke about and what now President Biden has said himself. COVID makes everything more difficult, but we're making progress there too. And it's certainly our hope and expectation that in the coming months, we'll be able to be once again, the world's a safe haven for those fleeing violence and persecution, just as we open our doors around the world for consular access for the types of issues that you flagged as well.
Great, thank you, Ned. We have a couple more student questions, and then I have one wrap-up question for both of you. So let's go to Matthew next.
Good evening, everyone. My question is for Mr. Kirby. Mr. Kirby, how is the Department of Defense modernizing its fighting capabilities for a 21st century conflict?
Well, that's a big question. And we're in the middle of getting ready for budget season right now. And I think while there's a limit to some things we can do to the current budget process in place, certainly the FY23 will have much more latitude. But I think you're going to see a couple of things. One, the central elements of the existing national defense strategy, which focuses on what we call great power competition, and so which is a forcing function in previous years to invest in capabilities and systems that are really designed to meet or exceed our needs in great power competition. That will probably continue. Secretary Austin has already said that those central elements of the existing national defense strategy are valid. So I think you're going to see, and look, we have a saying at the Pentagon that a budget is strategy. And that's true. When you look at what we buy, how much of what we buy, and where we put what we buy, that tells you a lot about where the Pentagon's head is. So watch the budget season coming up, and I think you'll see that there's going to be a continued focus on those kinds of capabilities to help us excel in the great power competition. And then the years beyond that, I think you're going to see that as well. The Secretary has talked a lot about innovation and research, particularly in the high-tech world. We've got some work to do, and whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's in space operations. Now we have the Space Force. So I think you're going to see all of that come to fruition over the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. And our last student question is from Lauren. Over to you.
Thank you, Lauren Burt, and I'm a graduate student with the MSB MAIPD program. And my question is, how does one prepare to be an effective spokesperson, especially in times of COVID-19 or political unrest? How do you stay on message and also remain transparent?
I haven't been doing that so good a job, so I'm going to let Ned take that first.
Well, look, I have the advantage of learning from the best, John and Marie, to name the two on this screen. So that always helps. I think what also works to your advantage, of course, is to speaking to a policy that you believe in. I know there are people out there who can memorize the lines and are comfortable saying what is put in front of them. In my case, I have been fortunate enough to work for now 2 presidents in a communications role, in whose policies I not only believe, but I think are profoundly right for our own interest. And so, as someone who worked and helped the campaign, someone who worked these issues on the Biden-Harris transition as well, it helped that I was fairly steeped in the policy direction. I knew where the administration would be going, and now in this job, have remained engaged in those policy discussions. And so I think it is, especially at a place like the Department of State, it's important that you are firmly firmly ground in the policy and not just the talking points, because it is it's easy to recite 3 or 4 sentences, but the first time you get a question that goes beyond what you've been briefed on, it really helps to have that broader overview and that perspective as well. So I think there are different formulas, there are different ways to do it. But I think first and foremost is finding an institution, an organization, a person in whom you believe deeply, and going from there.
I agree with all that. I would say for me, it's context. It's understanding the context behind the policies or the operations that we're conducting. One of the most common questions you get is some form of why. Why you're there? Why aren't you there? Why did you move this ship from this place to this place? It's why. And so it's understanding the context. And then to your specific point about the COVID stuff, you know, we because our briefing room is fairly sizable, but we've got to cut it down for social distancing. So you have maybe 15 reporters in the room at a time, and the others are all on the phone. And I have been struggling mightily to remember the people on the phone. So you got to go back from the phone to it's a tactical problem, but I'm really bad at it, and I've got to get better at remembering that not everybody that's attending our briefing is in the room. And that's probably going to be the case for who knows how long, months before we can get back to a full briefing room. And that's really the most comfortable. And I think Marie and Ned would agree. You know, it's just easier when it's all in the room and it's all face-to-face contact, and you can hear the body language, you can see it, you can feel it, you can feel the room. And right now that's hard for me to do. And again, I'm pea-brained, and I just keep forgetting that there's people on the phone that I got to go to.
Thank you, Lauren. We're a couple minutes over, but I want to wrap with a general question. It can be very quick, but for both of you, you know, you're taking these jobs. We're coming up at a time when we're coming up 20 years after 9/11, which for all of us was such a seminal experience. It set foreign and defense policy in our country on a course for the last 20 years. If you could tell the students sort of 1 or 2 or 3 issues that you think will help define the next 10 years, the next 20 years that you're focused on, that your secretaries are focused on, and that they should focus on in their studies. I know that's a huge question, but if there are a couple of things, what would those be for our students here tonight?
I'm happy to start. And it's actually a resonant question for me, because on 9/11, I was on top of Village A at Georgetown. I was a freshman. And to have thought back then where my career would take me and to be where I am now, you know, I wouldn't believe it if you told me. I think, you know, today the opportunities are in a number of areas. I think we've talked about some of them. One is China and the competition with China, and there are different elements of that. Tech, of course, is going to be a big one, and I think that if I had to place a bet on you know, where foreign policy and international affairs students will find the most opportunity in the coming years, I think I would focus on that. But climate too is another defining issue, not only of this administration, but it's going to be a defining issue of the coming years. And this is another area where the president has committed to this pledge of building back better and creating a new green economy with good paying green jobs here at home. But then also there is a large foreign policy element to it. There's a reason why Marie and John's old boss is now the president's special envoy for climate, because this is an issue that is now a priority for within our foreign policy as well. There are any number of others, but I think those are 2 that will be seminal going forward.
Couldn't agree more on those. I would add Africa and getting a really good grounding in sort of where the continent is going, and we'll go over the next 20 to 30 years, because I think it's going to be a huge driver of international security. Number 2 would be collective security itself, and we're going to have a chance to talk about this week with NATO. But the idea of collective security, and what does that entail? What are the responsibilities of a partner and ally to one another, and sort of how do you drive that forward? Because look, from a military perspective, we don't really do anything alone anymore. The United States military, almost everything we're doing with allies and partners and friends around the world, and they bring capabilities that frankly we aren't investing in, and that we don't have in the ranks, and we need to value that and move that forward in a way that's sort of cohesive. So it's not just ad hoc, but it's planned. And then the last thing I'd say is read a lot of history. One of the things I don't think that we always like to look at the age we're living in as, you know, nobody's ever done it before, unprecedented, never had. Actually, there's a lot of strings you can pull from history. And so I would also advise you to take a couple of days off of social media and just read a biography or a history book about whatever it is you're interested in, because I guarantee you there's wisdom there that you probably just you don't even realize. As Truman said, you want a new idea, go read an old book.
Thank you. That's such a perfect place to end for our students. A huge thank you to Ned and John. They have very busy, demanding jobs, and we're so grateful that you took the time tonight. And of course, a huge thank you to GU Politics and the School of Foreign Service, and to all of our students for joining tonight and asking such great questions. We appreciate you taking the time, especially on President's Day, to join us. I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.